ways that people in the Bible have gone from moments of failure to faith, and with an eye toward how we relate to God ourselves. Next week will be a little different with Palm Sunday, but it'll still have a similar sense in terms of about our connection with God. But this morning, we finish up this other part of the series with Saul becoming Paul. And, excuse me, that would seem to be an obvious choice, right? How many people went from that kind of failure in God's eyes to persecuting his people to someone who took a totally different stance? So in the 9th chapter, we're going to start with really after his experience of meeting Jesus on the road, and starting instead at chapter 9 with the 10th verse, where he is in Damascus and is being attended to by Ananias. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias," he answered, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying and has seen in a vision a man named Ananias, excuse me, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who invoke your name. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias went and entered the house. He laid his hands on Saul and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus who appeared to you on your way here has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. And he got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. May God add his own blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Well, let's get a little background in the story, because that'll help us know what's going on if we're not familiar with it all. Saul was a Pharisee. That is, a person who followed the law to the utmost letter. He describes himself in the letters he wrote later that are in the Scriptures now in our New Testament. He described himself as one who had not broken the law. Now, that tells us a few things about him. One, there are a whole lot of laws, and it wasn't just like nowadays we have a whole lot of laws in the books, right? But if we're decent people, then we just kind of do our work and get our paychecks and pay our bills and raise our families. Yeah, we don't really break them. I mean, it's kind of hard to break a law when you're a decent person, right? It was a little more complicated then. I mean, there were laws about how you did sacrifices, laws about how you put food in your kitchen a particular way because of dietary restrictions and other things, laws about what you could do on a Sunday. I know I mentioned this, but it still blows my mind. In Israel, for instance, on Sundays, they have in the buildings with an elevator, they have the Sabbath, there's Saturday, the Sabbath elevator. And it's programmed so that it will stop at every single floor. And you know why? Because to this day, it's a rabbinical law. You cannot push an elevator button on a Sabbath, because you're not allowed to start a fire on the Sabbath. And push an elevator creates an electrical spark, and that's a fire. So it seems odd to us. It seems very odd to us. But the laws were very specific in many, many ways. And Paul following those meant that he was a very detail-oriented kind of person. And when you read his letters in the Scriptures later, and you see some of the ways he words things kind of over and over and is very specific in his wording and almost repetitive at times, you begin to see that in his writings, I think, as well. But another thing is that in order to follow the laws, you had to be really wealthy. Because if you were going to sacrifice certain kinds of animals, as the law prescribed, then you had to be able to afford those animals. And we know that from learning and from the research and understanding of the temple practices that when they wanted to sacrifice a dove at the temple in Jerusalem, the cost of buying that dove was about a year's salary. That's for a dove. Can you imagine a goat or a ram or a bull? It's astronomical. Paul had some means. So we know that about him. He's still Saul as we're in the story now. What we also know is as a result of his adherence to that law and his belief in that law, he would have been very much supportive of the structures of the temple and how people worshiped the temple, and that meant he would have been supportive of the chief priests. And the chief priests were those who organized and kept the temple running, and including all of the money practices that Jesus overturned on his entry into the temple that one day. But that part is not our story. Our story is about Saul. And so we know now that Saul becomes involved in looking for those who are straying from Jewish faith by following Jesus. And that's something that is becomes very important to him, is maintaining the purity of the faith, of the Jewish traditions. It makes perfect sense. He follows the laws to the smallest letter, and so he's going to be very interested in the purity of the faith. And that means that those who are following Jesus, who has taught some challenging things, who ate on the Sabbath and said it was okay, told his disciples they could do that, and answered questions, who spent time with tax collectors and escorts, shall we call it, people who we wouldn't spend time with, right? Who partied with them and gave his life to those people. Then Jesus says, if you're sick, you go see a doctor. Makes perfect sense. If someone's not right with God, they can come see me. But that's not how those in power of the faith saw that. They were the ones who carried God's banner, as it were. You should be spending time with us. We're the ones who are really God's people. And his refusal to do that is part of what landed him in a situation that ended him putting him on the cross eventually. That's a part of that. So Saul now is completely opposed to anything that has to do with Jesus. And when Stephen, you go back into chapter 8, and before maybe, when Stephen is one of the followers of Jesus who is stoned in Jerusalem because of his belief in Jesus, Paul is not only there, he's helping to organize it. He's holding the coast. He's making it easy for people. And he watches the whole thing. Then he goes to the chief priests and he says, we got a lot of work to do. What if I head up toward Damascus? There's a whole lot of these Jesus people up there. I'm going to head up there and see if we can't roust them out and get them taken care of like we started doing here. And, of course, the chief priests, they're all about that. I mean, they've done everything they can to keep Jesus and his ministry, his mission, his words, his teachings as far away from people as possible. They're not having much luck. So they authorize Saul for that work. And they send him on his way. Now, I wonder about something in the midst of this. Here's where I start putting my imagination to work in the story. One of the places is when Saul is watching Stephen be stoned, he is right there when right before Stephen dies, his last words are, God, don't hold this against them. Kind of like Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them. I wonder if that had an impact on Saul at all. I mean, when you're enemies, and especially in the Jewish tradition where everything's about right and wrong, everything's about right and wrong, it's not really your thing to forgive the enemy. Remember, that's about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. God's judgment on people, on their sins, or on the sins of their parents or their grandparents or the generations ahead of them, is usually through some kind of infirmity, some kind of illness, some kind of lameness, some kind of physical issue. Whenever they see that, they know that somebody sinned and they're getting what they deserve. That's their story. That's their picture of it. So I wonder what impact it might have had on Saul. We don't know. But I wonder if it didn't have some impact on him when he hears Stephen say to the people who are killing him, God, don't hold this against them. That had to make an impression. That's not their practice. That's not their tradition. That's not the way they go about the world. Later, Saul coming to Damascus has the dramatic story, struck down, hearing the voice of Jesus, made blind, and hearing the voice of Jesus saying, Saul, why do you persecute me? Everything about Saul's understanding of the world is being challenged, of how he fits into the faith of the Jewish people, about what that faith means. It's all being challenged, and in an incredibly dramatic way. I kind of feel like it would get my attention if I was suddenly struck down by the Spirit of God and made blind. I would like to think I would notice that. I mean, that'd be bigger than getting slapped with a dead fish, wouldn't it? Your whole life has changed. What's going to happen next? What do I do? Did people with him manage to get him to some place? It doesn't mention them really anymore, those who are traveling with him. All we know is from the story, here he is at a street called Straight in the house of someone named Judas. Judas was a somewhat common name, so it wouldn't have obviously been the same one, the disciple. But there he was. And then here comes Ananias. So we kind of got the background story. We're going to see things that are happening with his travels on the road. And by the way, this is interesting to me too. In this story, right before we get to this Saul going toward Damascus, we see Philip, the disciple Philip, has been heading that direction. He's more than anyone in the beginning of Acts is out really stretching the boundaries of where the gospel is being taken. And Paul is, whether it was on purpose or just happened to be the choice, he's kind of following Philip to the north from Jerusalem. So now we come to Ananias. Here is a devout follower of Jesus. Now at this time, for the most part, all the followers of Jesus are also Jews. Jesus didn't tell people to quit being Jewish. He said, you know the Father through me. Jesus never stopped being Jewish. He was a very devout Jew. He came out of the tradition that was very strict in following the laws. Isn't that interesting? I mean, we kind of know that, but I think sometimes it's good for us to stop a minute and remember that. Remember, he said, I don't come to abolish or to take away the law. I come to fulfill it, to complete it. So Ananias would have understood the Jewish side of Saul, but he wasn't really understanding what was happening in this dynamic now. He hears in this dream from God, I want you to go to this man Saul. He's blind. And I want you to heal him. I want you to give him his sight and his health back. By the power of the Spirit, I'm going to give you. That's got to be a challenge for Ananias. And he even says to God, but wait, this is the one, right, that has been persecuting your people. This is the guy that's been after us, and you want me to help him. And God says, I have a plan for him. He's going to be a witness for me. That's got to be a challenge for Ananias beyond belief. People don't just change like that, do they, overnight? It could be a trap, couldn't it? Saul acting blind so that he'll get a little help from some of these Christian people. He can play it up. We see that kind of stuff on TV all the time, don't we? The old Mission Impossible show. They always found a way to accomplish, the mission. They're very imaginative. And so if I'm Ananias, I'm wondering there's got to be more to this story than it looks like. I mean, he came up here with the goal of rooting us out, discovering who we are, persecuting us, maybe killing us like they did Stephen. I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know if I want to take the chance. I don't trust Saul. But the question is not about whether Ananias trusts Saul. It's about whether Ananias trusts God. It's a very important distinction. And really the root of the whole message today. Sometimes when we feel led to do something, it's not about whether we trust the person we're helping. It's do we trust the God who leads us into a circumstance or into a situation. Anybody ever... I get this more than any other way anymore, it seems like right now. You stop at the gas station, you're gassing up, and somebody comes up and says, I need $10 for gas. My car's not, we're almost on our, we're on a trip. Somebody's got to go to the hospital. I got to get back home and see my sick mama. Different kinds of things. Anybody else? It's not just me, is it? So I'm not the only sucker in the room. Anybody ever give them the $5 or $10? Anybody ever do it just get rid of them? Once or twice, yeah. I'll listen to them a little bit. Anybody know they've been taken by that? Yeah. The last one I did, I didn't have any change, and he came out. I didn't think fast enough. I should have thought faster. Now, I think most of the time, I feel like most of the time, these people can use the help. That might mean that might what they need the most, but it's what they're capable of handling or receiving at that moment. But I know, like last time, it was about 2 months ago, and a guy came up. He said, I just changed in the bathroom, and so I feel a little cleaner. But he said, I can't. I need some money to get the rest of the way. I guess my car's right over there. Well, it didn't dawn on me, if you change in the bathroom, where are the clothes you changed out of? Because if you're poor, you're not going to leave your clothes behind, right? He didn't carry anything, so I think later. But what really got me, what put me back to that was when I saw him jump in a car with 5 other guys. I mean, when he got the money, he walked till he was about 2 gas pumps down, and then he ran. And he jumped in a car, had a bunch of other guys in it, and they peeled out. And I thought, well, you got suckered on that one, didn't you? But the point was, where was my heart? All right? I know that I've given people money that didn't deserve it, or didn't really need it, or they were using me to get the... But I can't feel like I have to be, I must stop giving to everybody or stop taking the risk, because God leads us to help. Now that doesn't mean I should be handing a 5 or a 10 out every single time somebody approaches me. I don't think God wanted me to give that man $20. I think I goofed on that one. Ananias has got to be wondering, does this guy really need my help? What's going on here? Who do we trust? We have to trust God the best we can. We have to trust God the best we can. Once Ananias believed and understood in his best knowledge, his best ability, that God was leading him to Saul, then he went. Then he committed himself to the task. And he did what was required. He did what he was asked to do. He put his hands and allowed God's power to flow through him, as God had said. And Saul's eyes were open. His scales, something like scales fell from his eyes, it says. And he was able to eat and regain his health, and the Spirit came to him, and then he was baptized. I'm guessing Ananias did that too. I don't think it says specifically, but he was baptized. Ananias allowed himself, by trusting God, to be an instrument. Now, what if Ananias had just flat refused? Well, Saul was a big piece of God's puzzle, so I would have guessed somebody else would have been called. And maybe somebody was. See, sometimes what's not in the Bible is worth thinking about too. Maybe it was just Ananias was the one that went. Somebody else might have had that dream and said, I don't think that fits with my sense of reality. I'm not going to do that. Don't we struggle with that sometimes? We get a sense, we have an understanding, however it is that we feel God calls us, that we understand God calls us and works in my own mind and my heart, my thoughts, and my faith, and gives us a task, and we go, I don't think that's the way that's supposed to work. And we're very sincerely trying to understand what it is that our life is supposed to be doing, or what task we're supposed to be about. And we pass on it because we don't think that's what God really wants. Have we missed sometimes on that? I'm sure we have. It's why it's so important, I think, for us to work on the issues of trust with God. Because that confidence, that trust, the better we're able to communicate with him, the better we're able to understand what he wants, and the more likely we are not only to go about his task, but to receive the power of his Spirit to accomplish those things. And that's what we talked about in the lesson this morning about prayer. That's why, guys, it's so important that the relationship is built through prayer so that when we trust God and understand that better, we can actually do the things he wants us to do. And that helps us to kind of move on, to get on with the life, to move on into the work that God has for us. Because he does. He has work for us. And that's really easy, too, to believe that work is really dramatic work, like Ananias did. I mean, this is a big story. This story changes everything about the future of the church. Everything. This event of Paul's change, this change in Paul's life, and the fact that Ananias didn't do a whole lot, right? I mean, he went, he prayed. God did all the work through him. Ananias listened to the call, to the task. He went, he did his thing. He prayed with Saul. He put his hands on him. He healed him. He probably had a hand in baptizing him. That's all. That's all? That's all? He was a part of one of the biggest stories in the entire Bible. One of the biggest stories in our whole history. Of human history, not Bible history, human history. Look at where the church is in the world now. I mean, I know we're struggling in this country. Almost every church out there is in some way. The faith is struggling. But it cycles as people learn and grow and we gain strength and we make mistakes. It seems like history is filled with these different times of cycling. That changed all of human history. That's one story out of how many millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of stories. Most of which have never been heard of or known. Things make a difference. And in the picture, when they all come together, this whole tapestry is formed. One of the most important parts of my personal history, I think, I wasn't even born if I were around. It was just my dad. When he was a sixth grader, his parents wouldn't take him to church. He wanted to go to church. They wouldn't take him. So he walked. Yeah, it wasn't that far. He's in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was back in, you walked a lot of places back in those days, right? 30s, 40s. He's born in 35, I think. So 40s. He walked to church. It's about 4 or 5 blocks. Not terrible, but he did it. He did it week after week after week. I don't know exactly why. He never said. He just said, I like going. I asked him, how come it was so important? He said, I like going. And he told the story. He was in a 6th grade Sunday school class, and he heard the preacher came in and said this to the class. He said about a dozen kids in there, and he said, I just have this feeling. He said that one of you boys in this class is going to grow up and be a pastor. And my dad said, he told me, he said, I felt so sorry for whoever that was going to be. And it was him. That's a big part of my story. It had nothing to do with it. Most people never hear that story. But over the life of his ministry, he had an effect on one person here or one person there or whatever. And it's all part of it. It doesn't have to be fancy or dramatic or huge. An act of kindness. Just a moment to help somebody think about something. Just one little thing. It's all a part of God's work. It's all a part of living a life of trust. And just being able to move along the path of our own journey as faithfully as possible. Whether it's just the work that you do every day by day, and you do it in such a way that honors God because you do it with a sense of integrity, with a sense of excellence and quality. with a kind of companionship, appropriate type of fellowship with the people you might work with. Or whether you're in some kind of an art situation and what you present and what you produce in your art, whether it's visual or whether it's through music or on a stage or whatever, it is something that presents a story or something presents a truth, an expression of faith in some manner. Or if you're an animal person, how you deal with those are God's creatures. Treat them well before you eat them, right? That's kind of yes in there. Whether you're on a ball field, whether you work with kids in a school, it doesn't matter. What we do, we can do with trust and faith. And we move on and make a difference. It always comes to trust, doesn't it? Our relationship with God is a relationship of trust. Man, live that with energy. Open yourself to it. Saul may be a big dramatic story, but all the little ones that we've experienced they've made a big difference to us, haven't they? And God says, I know the hairs on your head. He knows those little stories. He's moved those stories. No matter how small they may seem to us, they are big enough to be moved by God. Don't think God has not been at work within you. He's there every day. My dad said this one time, and I never forgot it. You maybe heard me say it here a couple times too. There's a miracle within your life. So go and live your faith. Amen.